Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Show Up with Camron Gran. I'm your host, Camron Gran, and today we're going to talk about setting up a game plan for when things aren't going so well. Because if you've been watching this channel for a while, you know that I've talked about the peak, or sometimes it's referenced as a wave on a beach. And when the wave's at the peak, you can't really fight it, because it's already at the precipice of where it's going to crash down on you again. But then eventually it will recede, and then you'll be back on like even playing field. But when it's at the peak, you're not going to have a way of coping with those emotions right away. And so I've been struggling with that myself, and so because I'm talking about that, I just want to start off by saying I'm not a therapist. I'm just somebody who goes along his own mental health journey, trying to give you guys little tips and tricks that I've used, and hopefully you guys can find some that work for you. I'm putting these out there because I know what it's like to be alone in those circumstances, and like having something online, just if you happen to stumble upon these, that can help you until you can get the help that you need. That's all I really ever want to do for people. And I want to talk about some stuff that's helped me, because we have coping mechanisms, which are healthy or unhealthy. But one thing that I learned in group therapy is it's very important to figure out those things that are intentional. Because if you use a coping mechanism without intention, it doesn't feel like it's doing something, or it doesn't have a purpose. And that can lead to you feeling like nothing's ever changing. So, for instance, if you're in a state where like you don't feel like, for me, I'm a storyteller. I love stories, and so if I can get lost in a story, that provides me with so much like carefreeness. It like makes me forget myself. But there are times where I'm so far over that peak that not even a story helps me, and that's when like you can use things that are like physical variations. So like one thing people have talked about that's worked for them is like just doing like a water plunge. Like usually it's cold water, and the reason why you do that is because it's enough of a sensory overload that it makes you forget yourself. And then it's also just something that I was always taught when I went to group therapy is like, you are struggling, and we're trying to get better, but if it gets worse, what kind of plan can we have in place so that way we're not lost without feeling like we have a way to get out, like has been the case before now. And that's kind of why I'm advocating for that, is because when you do things to make yourself feel better without intention, it makes you feel like you're still in that dark path, and you're avoiding the truth of what's happening. And for me, there's power in being like, okay, I am over this level that I can do something to change this thing that's bothering me. I can either let that thing take complete control, or I can just acknowledge that, oh, today is going to be a day where I just need to like be by myself. Or if isolation isn't what works for you, and you're like, if I'm isolated, it will make it worse. Today I need to go out and just be around other people, whether that's like going to the mall or going to a baseball game, or just like for me, movies help a lot because then I'm around other people watching something. And that's a good way of just being like, hey brain, I can't stay in this current path, so I'm going to go here, and I'm just going to like just allow the environment to kind of stimulate my senses. And the one thing that I always like to remind people, if that's the thing that you're choosing to do, is remember to play it out like you're negotiating. If you're choosing to go to a movie or to a baseball game, and your goal with that is to allow your like peak level to like subside, in order for that to happen, and especially if you're like constantly in that stressful like state of being where like you can't really like negotiate with yourself, it's more of like, okay, I can't think about this. I know that for the next 2 hours I'm planning to do this, so I'm gonna make an agreement with myself that for the next 2 hours this is what I'm gonna be 100% focused in, and no matter what else is happening, I'm here for 2 hours, and then I will let what was bothering me back in. And that's kind of like the little like negotiation, like agreement that I make with myself, which has become very useful. And then but then the only thing I will say with this method is if you're doing it enough and it's not helping you, maybe the thing you have to figure out is, okay, I'm doing the same thing, or like, how can I vary this? What other things are like the thing that I love that will help me? For instance, something that I love doing is going to the movies. And the thing I started noticing is like, oh, well, movies is just a story you're watching, and then my brain's very easily like just jumping into those worlds and just like being in it for those hours. But then I'm by myself, and like my brain likes to pick apart and like dissect or like figure out what I would do in those scenarios. And something that I started to feel like was like hindering me was the fact that, oh, I'm doing this by myself and I don't have an opportunity to talk about this afterwards. And so I feel like I'm robbing myself of something, because that talking and that like focusing on what I just watched or what I shared with somebody, if I went with somebody, can be very helpful in just figuring out I don't know, because I love movies because it's kind of feels like it's a psychological piece you're going through, and maybe it's because I'm an actor, is I like going and experiencing something I would never actually go through, but then putting myself in that scenario and being like, how would I get out of this? For instance, zombie survival like scenarios is very popular with friends, where you're like, okay, well, it's not happening, but if it ever did happen, what would you do? What would be your first 24 hours? How would you try to ensure that you would survive this kind of disaster scenario? And somebody that I know talks about this a lot and who has helped me is Jenna Fisher from the Office Ladies podcast, which, if you don't know, that's kind of a podcast dedicated to like the rewatch of The Office, because the two main girls from Angela Kinsey and Jenna Fisher kind of narrate it. And that is something that has helped me a lot, because I think they're part of the reason why I got into podcasts in general. And it was because most movies don't really sound or feel like a conversation. It's all very much like just a story you're watching, and you can't really interact or like hear discussions going on. And what I love what they do with that show of the Office Ladies podcast is like when they're dissecting an episode of The Office, they're also like, this is the scene that's happening, and they'll describe the scene, and then they're like, well, this is what happened behind the scenes. And the only thing that they don't do that I wish they would do more, and I'm surprised they don't because they are actresses, is I wish they would just dive into like the acting method more, because I think that's more fascinating to people that love acting, is just like, how did you get yourself into this certain state of being, or like how do you work on timing, because comedy is something that's very like a unique thing that you have to work on, because most comedy is purely based on like the timing. You have to get that right to get the joke to land. And if you do dramas, that's more of like, I feel like it's more natural like in a drama, because it's not really about timing. It's more of like letting the truth play out. And like you do want the truth in comedy, because that's one of the key components, but you also want to make sure that you don't go so far over the line that now the humor that was in the script is overshadowed by like the emotion, because always in a comedy the joke is what matters most, and that's kind of why I prefer them, because there are a lot of scenarios. Like last week I went over the show Mom, and like that's a very serious show that talks about very serious topics of like alcoholism and drug addiction. But what I love about that show is it presents those things in a very lighthearted way, while also making sure that that the characters are taking this material and what they're going through seriously. And I think that's why it's a great show, is it kind of walks that line with being respectful about what that looks like, while also trying to make it lighthearted, that it's more approachable. Because I think one of the things in reality that's hard to like figure out how to work through is a family member who is going through that thing, because most of the time they don't want to listen to you or acknowledge the stuff that they did that was wrong, and maybe that's because they feel like shame for that. And I've said this before, that the only thing I ever really wanted from my mother was just to talk openly about it to me, because even if she was struggling, the fact that she was being open and like talking about her struggle meant that she was trying to change it, or trying to change it to a point where she was in a healthier place, because the goal is usually to quit, but some things are so hard that like it takes a long time to quit. And so how do I say this? if you need to take a big step in your life and you only ever think about it as this enormous step, it feels like it's an impossibility. Whereas if you make that step smaller steps, like, okay, well, instead of doing as much as I was doing, I'll just do like a third of what I was doing or like a half of what I was doing until eventually it's either very minimal or not at all. Because some people have the discipline to do like what's called cold turkey, but where you just quit and you don't ever go back to something. Which is something, because last week I did watch the episode with Octavia Spencer, and her character later on, spoiler, is able to just quit, and that's because she didn't really have an addiction. Her problem was more of the fact that the way that she was handling and treating others was more of her problem. I wish I could tell you more, but they kind of leave you at the fact that she might not have had an addiction. She just got help from people who do. And they don't let you like actually see her after that point in her life, which I think would have been more beneficial if she came back at some point, just so we could see how once she left, if she actually was successful and really wasn't like an addict. And all this relates back to what I was talking about with the Office Ladies podcast, because the thing that I love to do, which it does really well, is like I love dissecting things that are in shows, and I've actually watched like the blooper reels of The Office a lot because of that show. Because I don't know, I've always been fascinated about behind the scenes of how something's made, because it takes a lot of work to make a movie or a TV show, and movies work way slower than TV shows, because movies usually they have like I think it's between 6 and 9 weeks. I don't think that's right, because usually it's 1 to 3 months. I just don't remember that how many weeks that is. I think that's 12. And if it's longer than that, usually it's because they have a longer post production or pre-production, but usually like the amount of time an actor is on set is usually between 1 and 3 months, unless it's kid actors, because anybody who's watched Harry Potter knows that they were on sets for almost 6 months to 9 months out of the year, and that's because they were doing a whole bunch of like schooling. I'm giving you a whole bunch of behind the scenes like movie stuff right now, but the point I was making, again back to the Office Ladies podcast, was just that dissection of that show felt like a conversation, and that kind of opened the window of what podcasting is. And because of that, whenever I felt isolated or by myself, or whenever I was like lonely and felt like I was in a room with people that were supposed to be my friends, but they weren't talking to me or like asking to hang out with me, and then I just felt like completely isolated, that show made me feel like I was actually talking to people, and like being part of something. And that branched me out to like getting more into like Good Mythical Morning, which is a YouTube show but hosted by Rhett and Link, but that like they now have spin-offs. They're like Good Mythical Kitchen, and I listened to that show more than Good Mythical Morning, mostly because something about that like rings true with stuff that I want to do, because I'd love to be in a group environment creating something with other people, because something I've always said that I love is the brain that happens when you work with people and it's on a project that we all know the end goal and we all care about the final like production and what something looks like. I love that creative brain. It does something to me, just being around people who are that into an idea and working so hard to make sure it comes to fruition. And listening to the behind the scenes of these shows that I love and how they created those things really helped me. And then I love storytelling. And then finally, my friend Mackenzie introduced me, or I introduced her. I can't remember because it's been a while since this happened. But I think she introduced me to Dropout, which is like an app for people if you ever want to find something that's about like improv comedy, and definitely a lot of sketches and stuff like that. It's based originally on like the YouTube channel College Humor, but the main thing on that app is Dungeons and Dragons, D&D, Dimension 20. And I've never been able to play that game, nor have I ever been really exposed to it outside of the things I saw in the early years of Stranger Things. And so now that I'm this far into the show, this is going to be released tomorrow on the 16th. I finished all of Dimension 20's campaigns today, and I was really like surprised because I mostly listen to it while I'm on the road, and I started listening to them because I really did not like where I was at in my life when this show came, and I didn't feel like I could actually have happiness in my current place. Sorry, that was really slow because I was trying to say that delicately, but there is no delicate way of saying that. The reason why I left Texas was because I realized that a cockroach infested like holding room, because I was waiting for my car to get fixed, felt more safe to me than the place I was staying. And that was a huge wake-up call for me that maybe that was a bad place for me to be, because I never felt welcome. And I just realized I need to get out of here, but if I focus on getting out of here, I'm not going to be able to have enough energy to get out of here. And so that's kind of when Dropout really entered my life, and kind of pushed me, because then I was like, okay, we're going to listen to this show. It's mostly campaigns about stories. And really they hit on a lot of the classics, because like a lot of them are the campaigns are based on like classic stories. Like the one I finished with, because I didn't watch the series in order. I kind of went along the things that I liked the most, and then it has side quests, which are shorter campaigns, and I kind of saved those for the end. But the thing, like the stories that they tell, like for instance, the one I finished was kind of like an animalistic version of Sherlock Holmes. It's called Mice and Murder. That was the one I finished with, and I was really surprised because I never got that it was about Sherlock Holmes based on what I like the trailers I saw, or like anything that I was like it was being spoken about. And that, like, when I realized it, I was like, oh, I love Sherlock Holmes. I would have watched this way sooner had I seen like the trailer made it look more along those lines. And I don't know, it makes me excited, and I have so many ideas of characters that I want to play if I could ever actually find a group in Minnesota that does Dungeons and Dragons that I could join, because the one thing that is a struggle for me, because I am a storyteller and I write books, is the fact that you don't have as much control over your character as you would like, and that's kind of the line that I wanted to learn how to process, because it's kind of the same thing along the same lines of acting, is like, oh well, you do what the script says. That's the job of the actor, and any kind of variation of that needs to come from the source material. And like in college, the number one thing that my instructor like drilled into me is like, hey, you can't just make any decision that you want. If you're going to choose to do something that's outside of the script, when I stop you, if I yell cut, you need to convince me that your choice came from the source material, and then I need to hear you tell me why something that you did was at this level. For instance, something that has really driven me crazy for a while, or, is just the fact that like, an example of this is like in Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban. It really bothers me that Harry blows up, like he's the most angry at his aunt when he's insulting his mother and father. And something that they talk about on stage is like everything has to happen in levels, and it's weird to me that the level of that anger is more extreme than when he finds out that Sirius Black betrayed his parents. And so like that level of like, okay, well, I don't know, that's an example of something like, okay, so because like films aren't shot in order. You kind of have to layer out like, I need to have this energy at a 7, because in this scene, that's when it hits a 10. And I don't know if that's like the actor's thing or the director's thing, because usually a director helps you find the level. But it always bothers me when like certain films don't like follow those things, because then it makes the characters feel disingenuous to me. But like the one thing that D&D does, and Dimension 20 does really well, is it's not only are they long campaigns, like episodes can be 2 hours at a time, and I only watch them that much because I do drive, and it's like something I put on that's like radio in the background. And it helps me like not only pass the time, but for me when I listen to things, it helps me like zone in and focus. And I don't know why that's always been the case with me. Is it's like, oh, I have this world that I'm inhabiting, but it's making me more aware of my surroundings. And what I love about the show is it's like you have all these mechanics that you learn, like how your character can go through things, but all that's dictated by the rules of Dungeons and Dragons. All those things that you wish your character could do, you can't really make them do unless your dungeon master, who's kind of the person in charge of the role, decides that it's okay. And all your choices are supposed to be what your character would want, not what you would want. And something that highly is something that's highly clear in Of Mice and Murder is the fact that like it's a murder mystery and the actors become aware of the twists, and sometimes it's so far before their actual characters are aware that you have to roll to like for insight, which is kind of like, does your character know what you know, or is it kind of going over their head and so they're not at all aware of what's going on? And if you get bad rolls, it just means like, oh, okay, well I don't know, so I have to like go on with my life accepting the fact that somebody, like for instance, an example of an insight that would be hilarious to me if you failed is like if somebody is in front of you and you see them like kill somebody in D&D, and then you roll an insight to know whether or not you actually saw it correctly. And if you roll a 1 and they roll a 20, you're pretty much guaranteed to be like, oh, that happened right in front of me. But they clearly, even though any normal person would be like, that couldn't that you saw what happened. They can't gaslight you into not knowing your truth. But nope, the dice kind of rule that, and you have to like obey what the dice say. And that's kind of, I think, fun, because that's part of the reason why I like improv so much. Is it's like you come up with like these fun scenarios and like these fun like jokes and like things to help what's going on, but you follow the rules of whatever game you're playing, because that game helps you come up with scenarios or jokes. I don't know how to put it more clearly. It's like jokes are like guidelines you structure around. Man, this was clear in my head, but I'm hearing it out loud and that does not make sense, because improv is following like a template, and you're building that like the story with somebody else who's following the same game plan, and that's where the comedy comes from. And the template of that show is Sherlock Holmes, but it definitely does not feel the same, because how they get to the conclusion is in their own way. And I don't know, because it's hard to explain if somebody's not an actor and somebody who doesn't get into psychology as much as I do, because it's kind of like, oh, well, I'm smarter than my character, but that doesn't matter because I'm being my character right now, and I have to be my character 100%. And I just find that completely beautiful, of like just giving into circumstances and letting the truth of the moment play out for you. And I'm talking about this because the theme of this episode is coming up with your game plan. And this all came together because my original game plan and the thing I coped with the most was movies. Movies have always helped me, but when I always go to the movies, eventually I feel like I'm not living, because I'm not ever present at home. I'm not ever like trying to achieve something. And that's something I've realized in adulthood, is it's hard to feel like you're achieving something when you don't have somebody you're trying to prove it to. And the danger of social media is eventually it feels like you're trying to prove it to the numbers. And I don't want to play, like, I want to play that game, but not in an unhealthy way. Like, I don't want validation to come from others. I want to come from within, and that is the healthy way that you should approach things as. But the thing that I realized with the movies is I'm like, okay, you love this thing, but doing this all the time and doing this one thing has made the thing that makes you feel the happiest in the world really lose its luster. And so eventually it felt like I was going but not being present. And then that's where the negotiating started happening, and I was like, okay, well, movies make you feel happy, we're gonna go, And if we're going to go and we're going to spend this money, or we're going to go because I have like A-list at AMC, so I have something to watch 3 movies a week if I want to. But if I'm going to go, I'm going to make sure I'm going to be there, I'm going to be present, and I'm going to make sure that I'm doing what's best for my character. That made no sense, sorry. I'm doing what's best for me, so that way when I get home, I can let all those negative thoughts in again. And that's negotiating for me, is kind of like I have negative thoughts. I can either ignore them or I can let them be like, if I negotiate with them, then it feels more of like I have control, opposed to me ignoring them and then they're just like intruding on every single aspect of my life. Which can be the case sometimes. The only thing that I wish is the fact that a lot of times when I am in those dark places, I wish I realized quicker that I'm in them so I could come up with a game plan. But that's kind of the other thing, is like you kind of have to keep track of yourself, and that's where like the first thing I talked about on this podcast, which is mindfulness, comes into play. And if you stop practicing mindfulness, you'll eventually stop being aware of the time you're losing in your depressive state. And so it became very important to me to be like, okay, I've been feeling this way for a while and I don't know why, and I can keep doing this and I can keep doing the same things, or I can change it up and figure out another way forward. And something that I started using Office Days for is I want to be on this sitcom, and Jenna Fisher has a book about like the actor's life and like how to like get an agent and how to get into the industry and all these like amazing tips and tools that she put out there in a book. And I just really admire that, because it's very hard to keep going when it feels like you're trying to achieve something by yourself. And I like the fact that, I don't know, the Office Ladies podcast made me realize that there was still an option out there for me. It's not dire. There's a term that was like coined recently, which is like, oh yeah, millennials are going through their quarter life crises. And I never thought that about myself, but then I realized I'm like, oh, I'm at this age and I feel like I haven't done anything. And then I'm currently 28 and I graduated from high school 10 years ago. And there's like a lot of pressure to be a lot further along in your life than I am. And that's when I realized, oh wait, you're doing the comparison game, and the comparison game is never a good thing. It only ever enters the conversation if I feel like depression wants to come back into play. And so the thing that I like to do in those moments is sit down and figure out what's going on. I have realized, though, that a thing that I like to do is I'm like, okay, well, I have this thing that's like the problem, but what kind of thing could help me with the thing that's the problem? And once I have this tool that could help that problem, then I'll face that problem. But until then, we're going to ignore that problem because I don't have that tool yet. But then that just is just like shuffling the problem around. It's not really getting rid of it. And eventually, if you keep shuffling things around, like your entire space is kind of intruded, and you don't really have like a real escape from anything, because you're just like entering one zone and going into another. And I feel like that's very unhealthy. And it took me a long time to realize that's what I've been doing. And something that I'm trying to do is not only make a game plan, but also stick to it, because I've said before that discipline is very hard for me. And I used to put so much weight in just talking and saying that out loud. But then I realized, well, acknowledging that you're bad at discipline is not developing discipline. That's just saying something to say something. And that's not normally my MO, because I actually hate saying something if I can't follow through on it. It's one of the things that I feel like is what causes me to not understand other people, is the fact that like I don't say something if I don't mean it, or I don't want that, or I also struggle with like not reaching out to somebody if it's been a while since we've spoken. And I constantly am playing the like, what are they thinking, or why aren't they reaching out to me? And that's kind of also a bad place to be, because then it's like you're trying to play mind reader with people that you haven't seen in a while. And unfortunately, everyone seems to leave people in the last places that we saw them at. I don't think that's a good way to do it, because people change constantly. And anytime time has passed without you seeing somebody else, you really should check in on them, and make sure like you understand each other, or it's still like the same thing. Because when you take things for granted, often that can lead to like misunderstandings or like hurting somebody without meaning to. And that's just something that I've noted and realized about myself, is like I was doing that a lot, and then I was believing somebody based on something they said so long in the past that time has definitely shifted. And if I had just checked in, I would have known before I did something that this was a bad scenario. And trusting yourself is a huge step that you have to develop, because if you don't develop self-trust, you're constantly fearing that you're doing the worst thing for yourself. And I feel like that, I don't know, it makes you feel so unsafe when you can't trust yourself, because really the only person that you're around a lot that you can check in on that will like validate your decisions is you. And so if you're not trusting yourself, how do you expect other people to trust you? Or if you're not trusting yourself, how can you know whether or not somebody that you're letting into your life is a good or bad person? Or, and that's actually something else that I've been struggling with, is like, oh, even if someone's a good person, that doesn't mean they're a good person for you. And that's a trick that you have to eventually dive into, because there are people that are good people that either don't view the world the same way you do, or don't, like, again, back to values, because I've talked about that so much, is like somebody can be a good person, but your values can be so far in like not aligned that you're like, oh well, I'm gonna make a confession right now. I love people, and so I love being around them. I love hanging out with them, and I didn't realize you can like somebody and then your values not be so far out of alignment that even though you like them, it's just draining to be around them all the time. And that's something that like made me aware, because sometimes when I'm alone, and being alone is a trigger for me and makes my depression higher. Part of my game plan used to be, I was like, well, you're alone. Maybe if you reach out to somebody, you hang out, or you make a phone call and you talk about it with them, or you just hang out with them doing something, maybe that will be a way to push the friendship forward, or get yourself out of your depression, or like any of those kind of things. And then I'm like, oh, well, you shouldn't use other people. I feel like you shouldn't use other people to make yourself not depressed anymore, or not have anxiety anymore. Like I describe myself as an extrovert and introvert, because my dream scenario would be the creative brain. Like, oh, I'm in a room full of people all being creative and we talk, but also I can be working on my own in a corner, and then only come into the conversation when I feel like I'm able, and then leave if I don't feel like I'm able anymore. Like, that's a dream environment to me. And like my job is just me by myself all the time, and like I didn't think that was a problem, but then I'm like, oh no, you are more of an extrovert than you thought you are. You do like talking to other people. You do like being around them, and you're kind of in a scenario where you're kind of isolated, alone. How can we change that? And that's kind of the step I'm on now with my game plan, is like, how can we change it so we're not isolated all the time? Like, back to movies. I love movies, but I do go alone, and I'm trying to invite people out to do things more. But also, I want to explore other things in my life. I don't want to only ever go to the movies. And I think it's a healthy thing. It's like, oh, these are things I love doing, but I should still try out other things, which is how I got into like comedy in Minnesota and like that kind of stuff. So I'm like, let me just try these things, see if I like them. If I don't like them, we don't have to do them anymore, but at least I tried them and I knew right away that I liked it or I didn't. The same thing can be said with like, I tried a cooking show. And I did like doing that, and I liked the person I was around who put that up. But the thing I realized is I was like, oh well, I'm very good with like I could teach somebody something I learned, but like something I don't think of myself as a chef, because to me a chef is somebody who like comes up with like original ideas and creates them, whereas a cook just follows recipes that they already invented for themselves. And I would think of myself more as a cook than a chef because I don't invent myself. Although I will say I came off with like these amazing like tuna rice cheese balls, and that didn't come from anything. I just thought of it and I was like, oh my goodness, these are so delicious. And that was an exploration that I found. And then it made me realize is I was like, oh, well, I want to do meal prep, for instance, but like following all these recipes or coming up with recipes by myself made me have so much anxiety because I'm like, oh, I'm only ever following this thing, but I'm not exploring, and that is creative. And having the chance to be creative is important, and that's kind of the thing I'm trying to implement in my life now. Is I want to be better with like what I eat and how to be like a better, healthier version of myself. But I also want to make sure that I have the freedom to explore and try new things, and that freedom is kind of what Dropout became for me. Is like I had this idea of what storytelling could be and how like games are, and then I found something that very much opened my eyes of like, oh, this is what role playing as a character could be. And ironically, I started off as an actor in a haunted house, and like I won a bunch of awards for it. But the thing that I was doing when I was all through all that is just like staying in character and just trying out different things. And some of it didn't work, and some of it was like way outside the realm of you shouldn't say this if we're not in like adult hour. And I didn't know because my brain was this is when I was a child. I wasn't aware of some things that are inappropriate, and I found those out as I grew up. And I was like, oh, that's what that thing means. I've always heard that like thrown around with people, but I didn't know that that was that kind of insult. I'll know that for the future. And that's kind of why I want to keep going at it with improv, because that was horror improv is what I started in, and now I want to get into comedy improv, and I'm following something that is kind of more of like guidelines first, because the only thing that I don't like in comedy, and I have used it before, but I do think you should start like because people use crude humor first, and I love crude humor, don't get me wrong, but it's kind of like I want to figure out other pathways and then choose to do this when I want to do it for comedic effect and not rely on this thing because it's like the thing that everybody thinks makes everything funny. And usually if that's all you have, then I think it's a mark of so mean. I don't know if I want to say it. I just don't think it's the best comedy if that's all you have. I think that there is creativity in finding like the most unique stories to make somebody laugh and put a smile on their face, opposed to just going with like the same old patterns, the same old routines that everybody always says. And that's kind of what like a Dimension 20 does. It's like, oh, well, everyone knows the story of Lord of the Rings, but like let's put like this one of the scenarios is called the like Escape from Blood Keep, and it's like all the villains of Lord of the Rings trying to win with it, but like they use a completely different universe. But if you're familiar with Lord of the Rings, you know that that's the universe. So then you're just like, oh, okay, well there's this unique campaign existing in this world that I already know, and it's actually very fascinating. Same thing happened with Sherlock Holmes, and then and it's also a way of like just being fascinated by somebody else's outlook. Like I've never heard of Starstruck Odyssey, and I'm not a fan of high fantasy, especially when it comes to like sci-fi stuff. And the only kind of fantasy I've ever liked is Firefly, because it kind of hinders more on like the mystical opposed to like the scientific. And a lot of sci-fi shows rely on science and like and that's too much for me. I like more of the like fantastical, mystical stuff. And I didn't know that, but like I saved that show for so long because I'm like, I'll find somebody else who wants to watch Dropout so I can see this with somebody, because I don't know if I want to watch it by myself because it just isn't my cup of tea. And then eventually I was like, you know what? It's been long enough. I miss because at that point, I'd gone through all the main cast's campaigns, and I was like, let me just start watching some of the side quests. And then I spent so long without the main cast, I'm like, you know what? I'm just gonna watch this so I get like I can see them again. And then I'm like, oh wow, this show is actually really really good. It reminded me of Firefly, and like the one of the people in it are named Shaban, plays like a psychic, and that's psychics in sci-fi are my favorite characters. River is a psychic, I'm pretty sure, in Firefly, and it's just something that like, because to me, when you, like, it's not only you're opening yourself up to like a 1950s world that still but is very much in the future, it's like you're also opening yourself up into like, how would I exist in this environment? And then I don't know, it just feels like a way of occupying your brain so it's not occupied with other things that aren't healthy or helpful for you. And that's kind of the thing that I liked about Dropout, and other podcasts I've listened to, is it's just like, oh, well, these are cool things I'm watching that also have conversations in them. So I'm learning while also hearing stories that I love, and or exploring worlds that I love, because like they're coming back with season 2 of what's called Magic and Misfits. This is basically a huge advertisement without me getting paid at all of Dropout, but Magic and Misfits coming for season 2, and it's basically like a retelling of the Harry Potter, with a bunch of people who definitely have a problem with like the original story of Harry Potter, and I don't think it's a problem. It's just fascinating to hear somebody else who has so much, like, it's just fascinating to me the things that they have issues with, or the things that like I have never thought about before, because all four, like, everyone knows the four houses of Hogwarts. It's like Gryffindor, Hufflepuff, Ravenclaw, and Slytherin. I am a Slytherin. Hello, nice to meet you if you're also a Slytherin. I don't think that is a negative. The stories, I guess, does give you that illusion that it's negative, but also somebody else. I don't know why people perpetuate like the story said that like Hufflepuffs are like the forgotten people, or people that aren't fit for any of the 3 other houses, which is what kind of they make in Misfits and Magic. Hufflepuffs are just and loyal people, and like. But I also have a problem with the sorting in general, and it's just fascinating to like hear people's like ideals and like the way that they took this world that I love, and like understanding like a different perspective. And that's kind of what I love when I meet other people, is I'm like, oh, the way you think or way you got to like what you feel about something, I never would have gotten to that place, but like it's fascinating to me how you feel that way, and that preoccupies my brain so much that makes me feel like I don't have room for depression or any of my mental health things. That's just something that my brain does, and something that I'm trying to like push myself to do is not only occupy my brain more, but also make sure that my body becomes more like used. Like, I'm very inactive, and I feel like that's a detriment to me, and I need to change that. And that feels like that needs to be the number one priority to my other goals. Because in order to get anything that I actually want from my life, I have to make sure that I'm the healthiest I can be, so I can be around for as long as I want, and hopefully be able to make as much of these videos as I can for you guys. But like, yeah, that's kind of the brilliance of what a game plan is a game plan, to wrap this episode up, is mostly to lay out the things that you love and figure out how you can make those things the most readily available to you when you are over the peak of being able to have decisions. Because there will become a time in your depression or anxiety or any kind of your mental health thing where you don't have control. And when you realize that you don't have control, it becomes the scariest thing in your life. And something that will help you in that moment is if you're like, I know that I have this thing set up for me to watch, or this thing to set up so I can listen to it. And I guess the brilliance of having campaigns that are so long is I remember most of like the stuff that happened in them, but they are so long that I feel like I could rewatch them and I would still have enjoyment from rehearing them again. Same thing as why I love books, is like, I am an avid rereader of books. I've read Harry Potter so many times, and usually it's because I love just puzzle solving, because Harry Potter is just a glorified mystery novel, and it's fascinating to like reread a book and then and then see those little clues that you missed the first time. And after so many viewings, it's just like, oh, and these characters are so fascinating, and like the way that they're like navigating this world is so interesting, and like to figure out how I would have done something differently, or like how this came to be, is just, I don't know, something I've always enjoyed. And that's kind of what I love about Dimension 20 in general, is like, oh, you create a character and then you learn how to be that character completely. So that way, when you've made the choice as the character, you can back it up and just stick to it, and then improvise with whatever positive or negative thing that happens. Because when you fail, you can fail in a big way and still have an amazing result. And it also teaches you so much just about being reliant and continuing when the odds don't seem like they're basically in your favor, not to quote Hunger Games. But it's just something that has helped me. But that's kind of me going through things that have helped me and setting those things up. Like showers are, again, if you're just trying to get yourself out of your current state of being, a cold shower is a good way to snap you out, because it's definitely changing like something immediately. Like texture is a good way to change something, because like that's why if you rub your hands together, or you do like take a shower, or like figure out the things that help you snap out of a mindset and change somewhere else, is a good way of making sure you're ready for the time when you aren't able to think and you're just in those emotions. That's it for this episode. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I definitely love sharing this nerdy side of myself to you guys. Hopefully you guys enjoy the fact that I am a very nerdy person. And I can't wait to see you guys next time. But as always, remember, as you go throughout the week, don't forget to show up for yourself, because you matter.